This is an A-level biology presentation looking at vaccinations and the concept of herd immunity. In this presentation, we are going to look through what a vaccine is, how vaccines work in terms of populations, and how vaccines lead to what's called herd immunity. Before you go any further, there are a number of definitions that you need to be secure on in order to make sure that you can progress through this presentation. On the left hand side you have a number of terminologies, on your right hand side you have a number of definitions. They are not correctly matched at this moment in time. You simply have to match the ones on the left to the ones on the right. You then have an extension question, which is why are some diseases caught more than once? For example, things like the common cold and things like the flu can be caught more than once. Give a reason for that. So whenever you're ready, pause the presentation, come up with your answers, and then you can restart the presentation to go through the answers. In terms of answers, you should know the antigen and antibody from GCSE. The antigen is the protein on the surface of any cell or any molecule that's used to identify that particular cell as self or non-self. We have an antibody, and antibodies attached to antigens that are complementary in shape. We have the term pathogen, which is a microorganism that causes disease and is infectious. We have the term lymphocytes, which are the type of white blood cell that specifically produces antibodies. Transmittable simply means that it can be transferred between an organism. We have active immunity, which involves the production of antibodies by an organism. Passive immunity is where we are introducing antibodies to an organism that were produced by somewhere else. We have natural immunity, which is again immunity inside, naturally occurring in a person's body as a result of an actual infection. Whereas we have artificial immunity, which is where the immunity is produced in response to a vaccine. In any question on an A-level paper, you can be asked about different types of immunity, and you need to be clear as to what those terms actually mean. So if they start talking about passive immunity is where the organism that's infected with the pathogen does not produce the antibodies. The antibodies are produced somewhere else and given directly to the infected organism. As a result, the infected organism has no memory cells, so it's very easy for them to get infected a second time, and if they are, they will then need new antibodies added in. We also have what's called active immunity, and active immunity is where we have the organism that has been infected is producing the antibodies and as a consequence has the memory cells to provide long-lasting protection from a secondary infection. We have the term naturally active or natural immunity, and that was because the immunity has resulted from an infection by a pathogen in the environment. It's not been artificially introduced, it's not been weakened, it's not been altered in any way. The person has got sick. We also have artificial active, and artificial active is where you have the organism that gets infected produces the antibodies, but the artificial part means that that particular organism hasn't been exposed to a naturally occurring pathogen. It's been exposed to some variation of the pathogen that has been weakened or made inactive in a lab, and as a consequence it's been exposed to a vaccine. That means that they go through the normal immune system, have the memory cells, and we don't have that secondary infection. In terms of vaccinations, again, it's one of those topics that comes up in GCSE. You have 5 statements in front of you with missing words and phrases. All you have to do is read through the sentences, work out what the missing words or phrases are, and then you can move through the presentation and check your answers. So at this point, pause the presentation and then restart when you want to go through the answers. The answers are as follows. An artificially produced version of a pathogen. Artificial pathogens have the exact same shape. Antigens, it's the antigens that have to be complementary to the antibodies in order to start off the immune response. we end up with memory cells at the end of that full response. What that means is that if the naturally occurring pathogen infects the host a second time round, we end up with what's called a secondary immune response. And in a secondary immune response, because the memory cells are there, the antibodies are produced in higher numbers and they're produced at a faster rate. And often they will show you that in terms of a graph. So they won't necessarily show it in terms of text or data. They will show you a graph where they count the number of antibodies at different points. And the secondary immune response, you will have a much higher number of antibodies produced, and you will have them produced at a much faster rate. Vaccinations play an extremely important part in managing pathogens, but they are not without the limitations. It's not just enough to discover a vaccination. There's a lot of other problems associated with vaccination programs. In front of you, you've got 6 pictures. Each of those pictures represents one particular issue that must be overcome when dealing with vaccination programs. All you have to do is try and work out what the 6 pictures represent. Pause the presentation now, and when you're ready to check your answers, you can restart. So pause the presentation. So the 6 pictures are as follows. The top left may cause is side effects. We have to have a vaccine with very small number of side effects. It doesn't have to be 0 side effects, but if the side effects are worse than the pathogen, then it's not a very good vaccination program. We also have economically viable. If each dose of vaccination costs £5 million, that starts to become financially impossible to maintain. So it has to be a cost-effective process. The third picture, we have to produce in large quantities. We need to be able to produce it. There's no point one vaccination per year when you have millions and millions of people to vaccinate. You need to produce it on a large scale. When you've produced it at large scale, you also have to have somewhere of storing it. And in some cases, you even need special environments to store it in. So you might need fridges, freezers, and so forth, which makes it even more difficult. When we've got the storage, we then have to transport it to all the different regions that it needs to go. And then, of course, once it actually arrives at where it needs to go to vaccinate people, we still need somebody there or some way of administering the vaccine. Even if it is some simple training for some volunteers in order to be able to give basic injections to people, we still need the manpower to be able to administer vaccines. So herd immunity. Use the diagram below to describe the concept of herd immunity. You've got 4 years. You have unvaccinated, vaccinated, and infecting people. And in which year would herd immunity occur? So there's 2 questions. Pause the presentation, come up with 2 answers, and when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. So pause the presentation now. It is year 4 when herd immunity starts. What happens is initially you have no vaccination and some people infected. Those infected people can spread to everybody in that population. As people become more and more vaccinated, it is less and less likely that anybody who's infected is able to pass that infection on, pass that pathogen on to a person who is unvaccinated. Remember, if a person who's infected passes it on to a vaccinated person, a secondary immune response occurs and the vaccinated person does not get sick. When we get to enough people in a population having a vaccination so that there is no possibility of an infected person meeting with an uninfected, unvaccinated person, is when we get herd immunity. Basically, the pathogen dies out because it's no longer able to spread between person to person and infect each other. And because they have a large number of people taking the vaccination to protect the small number of people who can't, then we have this concept of herd immunity. Herd immunity is not dependent on 100% of the population getting vaccinated. It's all about that high enough proportion. For the most part, you'd probably talking over 90% of the population needs to be vaccinated in order to protect the 10% that are not vaccinated for a range of reasons. Many people don't get vaccinated for medical reasons in terms of things like cancer patients, people who've had transplants and stuff. They are not in a position where they can have the vaccination because even that very weak virus could be enough because of their compromised immune system to have a huge impact. Therefore, there is a responsibility on the rest of us to make sure that we are vaccinated against such stuff to protect those who can't protect themselves. Even with vaccinations, it is extremely rare and certainly takes a long time to get to the point of elimination and stopping completely and eradicating a pathogen. Now, it has happened with some infections and some pathogens, but it obviously takes quite a considerable amount of time, and it also takes quite a considerable amount of the population to get the vaccine. But there are other reasons why we can only reduce, we can prevent spread, but not necessarily completely eliminate the virus. You can have mutations and spontaneous variations in pathogens, which means that it is no longer recognized by the antibodies that are given in the secondary immune response, and you need to go through the entire process of developing the first infection again and building up your immunity. It can be a case of that the pathogen is in a particular place where the antibodies or the lymphocytes can't reach them. So there are certain locations, for example, in the intestines, where you will not get antibodies in there, and therefore there are issues in terms of reinfection. Obviously, you have individual personal preferences where people choose not to have vaccines for religious reasons, ethical reasons, medical reasons, or personal reasons as they choose. So there are a number of ethical issues linked with vaccinations. Animal experimentation is a part of vaccination development. There is no way around it. We need to check how the vaccine works in fully functioning living creatures. And while there are plenty of checks put in place to minimize harm and so forth, it's a necessary part of the process at this moment in time. There is potential that the long-term side effects are not known. The vaccination may have some long-term side effects, which only will come up in 10, 20, or maybe 30 years' time. We also have the issue around using humans for drug trials and testing drugs on humans. We also have a case of where we've got to balance individual choice and a person not wanting to have a vaccine for whatever reason, and this whole concept of herd immunity. Do we force people to have a vaccine in order to protect the group? And again, as with anything, it comes down to cost. Should the cost of the vaccine determine when production stops? Supply and demand. As more and more people are vaccinated, do we get to the point of we don't need to make as much vaccine? Actually, there's only a small percentage of the population that could suffer this, so we'll stop making the vaccine. It's no longer making us enough money. So finances obviously does come into this idea of, are vaccines useful or not? Last thing to finish off is a don't stop activity, and all you have to do is get yourself into the subject material we've just gone through and make sure that you learn the terminology and stuff well enough so that you can go to somebody else or something else, should it be a pet, mirror, yourself, family member, whatever you or whoever you can find, and you have to talk about everything in the lesson for 2 minutes without stopping. If you hesitate, pause, repeat something, any sort of delay, then you have to start your 2 minutes over again.